Welcome back. Today we're going to tell you the full story of a new case, from the very beginning all the way to where it stands right now. This is the case of Suzanne Morphew. As of today, the only man ever charged with killing Suzanne Morphew is free on bail. $3 million. A trial date was set, then postponed. Not the first time he has avoided a day in court. 6 years ago, Suzanne disappeared on a Mother's Day morning, leaving her bicycle by a road in Colorado. 3 years later, what remained of her was found 50 miles from home. Twice, her husband Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with her murder. The first case collapsed before it ever reached a jury. But here's the part that most of videos about this case never slow down long enough to tell. It didn't collapse because the evidence was weak. It collapsed because of the person who brought the charges. This is the kind of detail that gets skipped in a 15-minute summary. It shouldn't be, because it completely changes the question we should be asking by the end of this video. Not only what happened to Suzanne Morphew, but what happened to the effort to find the answer. By 2025, the prosecutor who handled that first case was no longer allowed to practice law in Colorado. Not because of some other case, because of this one, Suzanne's case. This is not just the story of a missing woman and her husband under suspicion. That's the layer most people already know. The second layer, told far less often, is what happens when the system created to find justice for a critical stretch of time becomes the first thing standing in its way, and about a family left in the middle without a shared answer. Sunday, May 10th, 2020, Mother's Day. In Maysville, a small community along the Arkansas River near Salida at the foot of Colorado's Sawatch Range, Suzanne Morphew left her 3-bedroom house on Puma Path to go for a bike ride, the way she often did on weekends. This was the kind of place where almost everyone knew each other. A few thousand people, mountains of all sides, and quiet roads where a woman riding alone on a Sunday morning raised no alarm. Suzanne was 45. She was the mother of 2 teenage daughters, Mallory and Macy. The family had moved there to live closer to nature. That morning started like hundreds of other mornings in her life. It did not end that way. At 5:46 that evening, the Chaffee County Dispatch Center received a call. A woman missing near County Road 225 and Highway 50. Within hours, Suzanne's bicycle was found less than half a mile from where she was last believed to have been. A bicycle lying by the side of a road with no one on it. That was all investigators had in those first hours. In the week that followed, the search expanded quickly. Chaffee County deputies, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI combed the area around Maysville. On May 22nd, the FBI searched a construction site in Salida connected to Barry Morphew's landscaping work, the business he ran as an independent contractor while also serving as a volunteer firefighter for Chaffee County. Personal items belonging to Suzanne were found scattered nearby. Authorities asked residents to preserve all surveillance footage from the preceding days. And Barry Morphew appeared in a public video, looking straight into the camera, pleading, "Bring my wife home safely." By July, investigators had received more than 600 tips from the public. None of them led to Suzanne. 4 months later after she disappeared, when the official search had slowed down, Suzanne's brother, Andy Moorman, could wait no longer. He organized a large-scale volunteer search, calling people from across the country. Nearly 700 volunteers came to Chaffee County over 6 days at the end of September 2020, covering both areas the police had already searched and places that had never been checked. They found nothing. This is one of the most important geographic details for understanding why this case has taken so long. The area around Chaffee County is not a flat city that is easy to search. It is high mountains, dense forest, and remote valleys stretching for hundreds of square miles. The kind of terrain where even a trained search team with dogs and modern equipment can walk right past something critical without realizing it. This is not an excuse for anyone. It's simply the reality of the land where this story took place. And it will matter even more towards the end of this video. That is what the public knew in the first year. A woman had vanished in broad daylight. A community mobilized hundreds of people to look for her, and not a single trail led to an answer. No one, including her family, knew that it would take more than 3 years before the question, "Where is Suzanne?" would receive even a partial answer. And that the path to that answer would take a turn almost no one anticipated. In any missing persons case, investigators start with the people closest to the victim. In Suzanne's case, that was her husband. Investigators began examining Barry Morphew's phone data and found something unusual. His phone activity on May 9th, the day before Suzanne was reported missing, did not fully match what he had initially described about where he was and what he was doing. When asked about it, Barry offered an explanation. He had been running around the property shooting ground squirrels, animals that he said had become a constant problem around the house. He told investigators that in the 2 years he had owned the property, he had shot about 85 of them. Now, it's important to be clear about this because it will matter for the rest of the story. At this stage, this was only Barry Morphew's answer to an investigator's question. It was not a confirmed fact. It was not a proven lie. It was an explanation that had not been independently verified beyond his own words. But it was unusual enough that investigators kept digging. Over the following year, Barry Morphew was interviewed multiple times, not once, but in a series of conversations that stretched over many months. And according to investigative records released later, his account in certain details from one interview to the next, each time appearing to adjust to information the investigators had just shared with him. This is the kind of pattern that can shift an investigation. Not a single piece of evidence, but a pattern. If the pattern is real, investigators in most cases treat repeated changes in a story across multiple interviews as a signal worth pursuing further. On its own, it's not proof of guilt. People can remember incorrectly or tell inconsistent versions under stress or panic and still be completely innocent. But it was enough to keep the investigation from stopping there. Cell phone signal data, which tower a phone connects to, and when, has become one of the most common tools in modern investigations because it exists independently of anyone's memory or story. It does not tell investigators what a person was doing, but it can tell them where that person was or where they could not have been. And that is exactly the kind of discrepancy investigators found when the whole shooting ground squirrels account didn't match the data showed. Meanwhile, life outside the investigation continued. Less than a year after Suzanne disappeared, the house on Puma Path, the home she'd shared with her husband and 2 daughters, was listed for sale and then sold. A community that still did not know what had happened to one of its own watched her house change hands. That was the foundation that nearly a year after Suzanne vanished led to this. Barry Morphew became more than a person of interest. He became a defendant. On May 4th, 2021, Chief Investigator Alex Walker IV of the 11th Judicial District Attorney's Office completed a 130-page arrest affidavit. The next day, Barry Morphew was arrested. The charges? First-degree murder, tampering with evidence, in attempting to influence a public servant. He was released on a $500,000 bond the same day the 130-page affidavit was made public. This document painted a detailed picture that Barry Morphew sought to control Suzanne, render her defenseless, stage the scene, and construct an alibi for the period when she was believed to have died, May 9th or 10th. It described a sequence of actions alleged to be deliberate, not a sudden outburst. And it's important to stop here because this is the point many tellings of this case skip. That affidavit was never tested in front of a jury. It was a charging document, a version of events according to the prosecution, built to be presented to a grand jury and later a trial jury. It was not, and has never become a verdict. Under American law, and for the story we are telling, that distinction is not a technical detail. It is the entire issue. News of the arrest spread quickly across Colorado, and then nationally. The case became one of the most closely watched in the country that year, and continued to be followed by major true crime programs, including CBS's 48 Hours. A community that had spent months searching for Suzanne now watched the man who had stood in front of cameras pleading for his wife's safe return walk out of jail in handcuffs. Not long afterward, and again later, when they first spoke publicly about the charges after they were dropped, Barry's two daughters, Mallory and Macy, chose to stand with her father. "We know he had nothing to do with our mother's disappearance," one of them told reporters, breaking the silence they had kept for a long time. That position is the one they have maintained without change through all the years that followed. A detail worth remembering, because it will return later in this story. Now at the time, no one, including the prosecutor who brought the charges, knew that the path to a courtroom would never be completed. Not because the evidence was too weak to convince a jury, but because that path was about to be blocked by the very person leading it. This is the most important chapter for understanding the next 6 years of this case. During pre-trial preparation, Barry Morphew's defense attorneys discovered something. The prosecutor had not timely disclosed evidence that could have been favorable to the defendant. DNA from an unidentified male found in Suzanne Morphew's vehicle, later reported to match the profile of a man with a prior sexual offense history. Under American criminal procedure, this is the kind of evidence the prosecution is required to share with the defense as soon as it's obtained. It's not optional. It was not the only problem. As the defense continued digging, they found additional instances of delayed or missing disclosures. The judge overseeing the case determined that the prosecution, led by 11th Judicial District Attorney Linda Stanley, had repeatedly violated mandatory discovery rules. As a sanction, the judge barred the prosecution from using 11 of the 16 expert witnesses they had endorsed, experts on DNA, vehicle data, and cell phone analysis. By the end of this process, the court excluded a total of 14 prosecution experts. Consider the scale of that. Nearly the entire team of experts the prosecution planned to use to prove its case to a jury was barred. Not because the scientific evidence itself was flawed, but because of how the prosecution had handled the legal processes around it. The discovery process in American criminal law exists for a very specific reason. It requires the prosecution to share with the defense everything it has, including evidence that might help the defendants, so that the trial is fair to both sides, not only to the side bringing the charges. This is not an administrative formality that can just be waved away. When the prosecution fails to comply, the consequence is not merely an administrative fine. It is the court's ability to trust the entire case the prosecution is presenting. Without those experts, the prosecution had almost nothing left to bring before a jury. On April 19, 2022, only days before the scheduled trial, Linda Stanley and her team filed a motion to dismiss all charges. The dismissal was without prejudice, meaning the prosecution retained the right to refile if new evidence emerged. But at that moment, the only thing certain was this: no one had been convicted. There was no answer, and Suzanne Morphew still had not been found. Sit with that fact for a moment. This was not a case in which the evidence was simply too weak to persuade anyone. This was a case in which the people responsible for presenting that evidence properly failed to do their part. And the cost of that failure did not fall first on Linda Stanley. It fell on a family that still did not know where their mother and wife was. The case officially became a cold case, and for the next 3 years, the question, what happened to Suzanne Morphew, received no public answers. From mid-2022 onward, the public life of this case nearly stopped. There was no trial, there was no official suspect, there was only a family, and an unanswered question that hung over every season, through 2 more Mother's Days that Suzanne was not there to celebrate. But the Colorado Bureau of Investigations did not close the case just because no one was being prosecuted. The investigative work continued more quietly, behind what the people could see. On September 22, 2023, more than 3 years after Suzanne disappeared, the CBI announced that remains identified as hers had been found near Moffett in Saguache County, about 50 miles south of her home in the San Luis Valley. This is a moment worth pausing for a long time, not rushing past. For 3 years, Suzanne's family had lived with a particular kind of grief, not the certainty of loss, but the suspension of not knowing. There was no body to mourn. There was no place to set the question, what now? And then begin to move forward. Now that question had a partial answer. After 3 years of nothing, this was the first thing that was real, that could be touched, that could be confirmed. Suzanne had been found. But it also opened a new question, no less heavy. What had actually happened to her? And why had it taken 3.5 years to answer the first question when the first charges had already collapsed so early? Moffett, where the remains were found, sits in the San Luis Valley, a vast high desert plateau in southern Colorado, far from the area around the Morphew home, in a different county, under different investigative jurisdiction. This was not an area the 2020 search, even with 700 volunteers, had focused on. The geographic distance, 50 miles across difficult terrain, is part of the reason why knowing where to look was so much harder than knowing that someone needed to be found. 7 months after the remains were found, on April 29, 2024, the autopsy results were released. Suzanne Morphew's death was ruled a homicide. The specific cause could not be determined by a single clear method, but during analysis, forensic scientists found traces of 3 chemicals in her remains: butorphanol, azaparone, and medetomidine, known in veterinary medicine by the acronym BAM. Now, these are not medications used in ordinary human medical treatment. BAM is a combination of sedative and anesthetic drugs used by wildlife biologists, game wardens, or licensed hunters to temporarily immobilize large animals, deer, bears, elk, for research or population control. One biographical detail reported publicly long before any charges related to BAM is worth repeating here because of its relevance. Before moving to Colorado in 2018, Barry Morphew had worked in a deer farming in Indiana, a field that often requires familiarity with methods of immobilizing and handling large animals. This is a confirmed biological fact, not an inference about motive or behavior. This video leaves it as a detail without interpreting it for the audience. This detail is unusual enough that it becomes an entirely new question, separate from everything known before. How and from where did a compound that circulates legally only within a very narrow group of people, those licensed to work with wildlife, end up in a body of a woman who disappeared during an ordinary bike ride in a residential area, not in the wilderness? This is the moment the story shifts from an unsolved disappearance to a scientific clue that can narrow the list of people who could have been involved. Because not everyone has access to a compound like that. Identifying these chemicals precisely in remains that had been outdoors for more than 3 years is neither simple nor quick. It requires specialized forensic toxicology, often sending samples to dedicated laboratories and waiting through multiple rounds of confirmation before results can actually be released with any kind of confidence. That is part of the reason it took 7 months, not 7 days between the discovery of the remains and the public announcement of what had been found in Suzanne. That question could not receive a public answer for nearly another year. But it quietly reshaped the entire direction of the investigation going forward, while in parallel, a completely separate process, unrelated to forensic science, was reaching its own conclusion. While investigators continued working behind the scenes with the questions raised by the BAM foundings, a different process, entirely separate from the criminal investigation, was unfolding. The Colorado Supreme Court Attorney Regulation Council was examining Linda Stanley's conduct in the 2021 Morphew case. This was not an investigation into whether Barry Morphew was guilty. This was an investigation into whether the prosecutor, who had been responsible for the case, the person representing for the public's interest in the courtroom, had met her professional obligations. The board's conclusion, made public in 2025, Linda Stanley should be disbarred. Not only for the discovery violations that had caused the 2021 case to collapse, the disciplinary record also noted additional issues. She had made inappropriate public statements to the media during a high-profile prosecution. She had failed to adequately supervise the prosecutors under her. And perhaps the most striking detail in the entire record, she had initiated an unfounded investigation into the very judge overseeing the Morphew case simply because she disagreed with his rulings. So let's take a moment here, because this is the exact moment that flips the way the most people have been taught to understand this story. This was not a case in which the evidence was simply insufficient to charge someone. This was a case in which the head of the prosecution, according to the official findings of Colorado's own legal profession, had conducted herself so poorly that she was no longer fit to practice law, while she held the fate of a murder prosecution in her hands, and while a family waited for the only answer they needed. The members of the disciplinary board were trying not to solve who killed Susan Morphew. Their job was a narrower question, but one no less important to this entire story. Was the person responsible for seeking justice for Suzanne doing her job correctly? Their answer was no. Stanley's appeal was later denied. The Colorado Supreme Court upheld the disbarment by a 4-2 vote in September of 2025. She was barred from practicing law in Colorado for at least 8 years. Now, one important detail needs to be stated clearly. At the time the decision was issued, Linda Stanley was not a former official who had left her office long ago. She was still sitting as district attorney for the 11th Judicial District, an elected position. The disbarment meant she no longer met the legal requirements to hold that office. Then she was forced to leave the very office she had used to prosecute this case. This was not a symbolic penalty. It was the end of her entire prosecutorial career, and it came from the same case in which she was supposed to be the strongest guardian of justice. This is the part of the story that is rarely told alongside everything else, even though it ran parallel to all of it. The 3 years Suzanne Morphew's remains still had not been found when the case was a cold case with no public progress. That was also the period in which the person who had once stood up to charge the primary suspect was, according to the findings of her own profession's disciplinary body, conducting herself in a way that made justice harder to achieve. The criminal investigation, now under a new team, the 12th Judicial District Attorney's Office, led by Ann Kelly, continued working with what the science had provided: the 3 chemicals in Suzanne's body, and the question of who in the state of Colorado could have legal access to them. According to the later indictment, veterinary prescription records showed something notable. At the relevant time, only 1 individual in the entire state of Colorado was legally authorized to obtain BAM. That individual was Barry Morphew. It is essential to state this with exact precision. This is a detail contained in the prosecution's indictment, the charging document in a case that has not yet been tried. It is not a conclusion that has been tested and cross-examined in court. The same indictment also alleged that Suzanne's body had been moved at least twice after her death. The specific mechanism the prosecution used to reach that conclusion has not been fully disclosed to the public at the time this video is being made. On June 18, 2025, a grand jury in the 12th Judicial District formally indicted Barry Morphew on first-degree murder. The second time in his life he faced the same charge. 2 days later, he was arrested in Arizona. According to the arrest report, he had been using an alias before he was found. He was extradited to Colorado. In July of that year, he appeared in court for the first time since the new arrest and was released on a $3 million bond, 6 times the amount of his 2021 bond. That difference itself says something. Between the 2 arrests, the justice system's assessment of the risk Barry Morphew represented had changed significantly. There was new scientific evidence, and now also a history of using a false name to avoid detection. This time, the case was no longer under the 11th Judicial District, where Linda Stanley had been in charge, but under the 12th Judicial District, led by Ann Kelly. The courtroom was packed with reporters on the day of his first appearance. Public attention, which had cooled during the 3 years the case was cold, returned almost immediately. In January 2026, Barry Morphew entered a not guilty plea. This was the second time he had pleaded not guilty to the same charge, nearly 5 years apart, with 3 years in between, during which, according to the public record, no agency formally treated him as a charged suspect. He is still waiting for trial. Under the law, he remains presumed innocent in a court. Not a YouTube video, not public opinion, says otherwise. There is a part of this story that doesn't appear in any scientific report or an indictment, but it may be the most painful part, and the reason this story cannot be told completely if it stops only at the evidence. Mallory and Macy Morphew, Suzanne and Barry's 2 daughters, now adults, have publicly stood with their father through both times he was charged, from 2021 to the present. In February 2026, attorneys representing them filed a motion asking the state to return their mother's remains, an action that shows they are actively participating in the ongoing legal process, not standing outside it as observers. That motion was later withdrawn. Meanwhile, Andy and David Moorman, Suzanne's 2 brothers, have taken a completely different path. Andy was the one who, in 2020, organized a large volunteer search when the official efforts stalled. David, in a victim impact statement filed with the court in August 2025, 1 month after Barry's most recent arrest, asked the court not to allow his brother-in-law to remain free on bond. In that statement, David Moorman wrote that there were nights he lay awake thinking about the final minutes of his sister's life. This is the voice of a brother carrying a very specific, very real grief, not a legal conclusion, and the script does not present it as one. But it makes it clear that for at least part of Suzanne's family, there's no longer room for doubt. This is not a family arguing over money or an old disagreement that has been simmering for years. This is a family forced to confront the largest question anyone can face. Who killed the person they loved? And unable to reach agreement on the answer, even among the people closest to Suzanne. The two daughters, perhaps, are doing the only thing they can do with the father they have known their entire lives. Believing him, even when the public evidence points in a different direction. Suzanne's two brothers, perhaps, are doing the only thing they can do for their sister, refusing to let that doubt or the memory of her be set aside. None of them is simply right or wrong in a way that's easy to sort. That's exactly what makes this part of the story the hardest to hear, and what reminds us that behind every indictment and every disciplinary ruling, there are still real people who have to live every day with this question. Every year on Mother's Day, people who knew Suzanne still gather in Chaffee County to remember her, a quiet ritual repeated year after year, while the trial they are waiting for still has not arrived. That may be the most honest image of what remains after 6 years. Not a community that has found an answer and moved on, but a community that has learned to carry this question year after year alongside her family. In June 2026, Barry Morphew's attorney filed a motion to continue the trial, which had been expected that year, citing that what they described as a massive volume of discovery the defense needed to review. In the month before that motion alone, his legal team had filed 31 different motions with the court. The judge granted the continuance. The trial was pushed, most likely into the first half of 2027. A specific date to be agreed upon by both sides and set before June 1st of that year. A hearing on outstanding motions was scheduled for early July 2026 to clear some of the legal work before the main trial. District Attorney Ann Kelly opposed the delay. Suzanne's family, through David Mormon, also opposed it, expressing concern that Barry Morphew, given his prior use of an alias to avoid detection in Arizona in 2025, could present a flight risk if his time free on bond was extended further. This is where our story closes the circle, returning to the exact point where we began. A man free on $3 million bond. A trial that still has not taken place even though it has been discussed since 2021. A family that still has not found agreement and may never find it, no matter how the trial ends. But one thing has changed since we started the story. We now know why the path to this point has been so long. Not because scientific evidence was missing. That evidence eventually led to a new indictment built around the detail not everyone could have accessed. But because during a critical stretch of that path, the system created to find the truth failed to do its part, and no one can recover the 3 years that were lost because of it. There is no guarantee that a 2027 trial will answer the question Suzanne Morphew's family has carried for 6 years. A jury could convict. It could acquit. The trial could be postponed again, as it already has. Those are things that, at this moment, no one, including us, including the people inside this case, can say with certainty. The only things that are certain are what the public record allows us to say. A woman never came home from a Mother's Day bike ride. A first prosecution collapsed, not because the evidence was missing, but because the people responsible for it failed to handle their part of the process, to the point that they were later stripped of their right to practice law by their own profession. A family had to learn to live with an unanswered question for 3 years, and then learn to live with an incomplete answer for 3 more. And now, continues to live with a split among the people who remain. Suzanne Morphew should have had a much shorter path to justice than these 6 years. She did not get that. Not because no one tried to find the truth, but because at least once, at a decisive moment, the person standing up to represent that truth was not equal to the role. The trial is still ahead. The question is still open. And this story, unlike most of what we tell on this channel, does not have an ending we can hand back to you. Perhaps the only thing we can offer at this moment is a reminder. Justice is not something that happens automatically just because the truth exists somewhere waiting to be found. It requires people, prosecutors, investigators, judges, to do their part correctly every time, without exception. When one of them fails, the cost does not fall on them first. It falls on the people waiting for an answer they deserve to have. The case of Suzanne Morphew is still ongoing. Barry Morphew's trial is expected to be scheduled before June 2027, and when there is a development significant enough to change what we have told today, this channel will return with an update. We will not quietly edit this video. If you want to follow the official progress of the case, the public court records in Colorado are the most reliable source, more reliable than any speculation, including speculation on this channel. Thank you for spending this time with the story. If this channel gave you something of value today, consider subscribing so you don't miss when the update of this case moves forward.